Okay, this video is to talk about the next section after the introduction and background that you will submit for your systematic review, and that is the theoretical background. So, this is another article that I have published that was a research article. So, the title you can see here, Spiritual Pain and Meals on Wheels Clients. So, let me just tell you about this real quickly since we just talked about the introduction and background. So you can see here my introduction is about 2 paragraphs. And I'm starting off talking about how elderly Americans report that religion is an important part of their life. So then I give some information about that and then explain why we might care that spirituality and religion in the elderly is something that's important to us. So then, as far as the background, I go into talking about each one of the variables that I was interested in much more detail. So it's really the same format, except the way this journal wanted it was for it to be broken up into the different sections. So here's the introduction. It was clearly delineated. And then I talked about spiritual pain in great detail. One reason for that was because people don't know what it is, so I really needed to explain that. If it was something like stress, I might not have had to go into such detail because people know what stress is, but in this case, they don't know what spiritual pain is. So I went and talked about spiritual pain for 2 entire big paragraphs. And then I went in to talk about the other variables that I was measuring: stress, depression, loneliness, and religious coping. So I talked about all those, and then the relationship between those and the biological piece. So that's ultimately going to, if you go back to the title, tie it all in together: spiritual pain and Meals on Wheels clients. And then I go, so there's the biological, and then here's something on the Meals on Wheels population, just in case people don't really know who they are. So here's the theoretical framework. So really, you can pick anything. It doesn't have to be nursing. It can be from any field. It can be any model that you find anywhere. And sometimes you'll see that it's called theoretical framework or conceptual model. This one that I chose, I needed to have or to use a biobehavioral interaction model because my thought and my underlying theory behind all of this was that stress, depression, loneliness, religious coping, spiritual pain, all of these psychosocial factors right here interact and influence each other. They will collectively or by themselves influence the biological response. So the salivary cortisol and salivary interleukin 1 beta that I measured, which will ultimately affect health outcomes. So actually, this is from one study that I did 2 papers on. So this paper specifically focuses on just spiritual pain because it was different, and so I wanted to have it out by itself. My other paper is pretty much the same paper, except I focus more on stress, depression, loneliness, and religious coping. So this model is a part of a much bigger model. So in the much bigger original biobehavioral interaction model, they propose that all kinds of different factors can influence the biological response that ultimately influences health outcomes. So for example, it could be psychosocial issues. It could be environmental issues like smoking or where you live. It can be all kinds of different things, physical factors like genetics. So this model was actually much bigger than this. So this model had 7 or 8 different domains that could all influence biological response and ultimately health outcomes. So what I did, I just adapted the biobehavioral model, for my needs in this study. So I just took the psychosocial domain, put my variables in there, and how they influence the biological response in my variables and how that ultimately influences the health outcomes. So you don't have to find the very perfect theoretical model that fits perfectly with all your variables. What you need to do is find something that works and that you can adapt and that you can defend that reasonably. So, I basically was able to adapt this because my defense to adapting the original model was that this is simplified. So this is a simplified conceptual model of the study, and that's illustrated in figure 1. So in other words, I didn't care about the environmental factors. I don't care about genetic factors. I don't care about anything else except these psychosocial factors and how they influence the biological response that ultimately influences the adverse health outcomes. So the other thing I want to point out is that you'll notice in both of my systematic reviews that I gave you copies of, the loneliness one and the sex hormone one, neither one of them have a section that talks about the theoretical basis for this systematic review. So the reason for that is that we're limited when you go to submit a manuscript for publication. You're typically limited on number of words. So that might be 2,000 words or 3,000 words, or it could be up to 5,000 or 6,000 words. And so sometimes certain sections are not published because there just wasn't enough room for them. So that's why that's not here in my loneliness and cognitive function systematic review. However, I do want to point out that when we get to the point when we describe the studies and we describe our findings, that was one of the things that I talked about. So I had these 10 research studies that I found. 5 were cross-sectional, 5 were longitudinal. And none of them address specific theoretical basis for their research, which is really odd because you can see in mine, I did, and in a research study that's very standard and expected that the theoretical basis will be addressed. So I pointed that out because that's significant to me in my thought process and where the research needs to go, because I'm interested and think it's relevant, the biological piece. And it was just kind of surprising to me that none of the studies address the specific theoretical basis, which would be the biological piece. So I talk about that here. So I say none of them address specific theoretical basis. However, all of them propose that certain psychosocial factors, including loneliness, were thought to influence cognitive function in the older adult, and this was the implied theoretical basis. In addition to loneliness influencing cognitive function, authors of 2 studies propose that psychosocial and biological factors, such as the HPA axis, might interact detrimentally to influence cognitive function. So they all talked about this biological piece, but it was implied. It wasn't specifically written like this or like on my research paper where this is the theoretical basis. This is the theoretical framework that I use. So that's just a little side note. So I think that's all you need to know about choosing your framework. So in summary, I would just find something that is very similar, something that can be used, that's relevant to your variables. And if you need to adapt it in any way, that's typically acceptable, but you will just need to state the reason why, and then most of the time it's not a problem. So if you have any questions, let me know.